The splash echoed across the still waters of the Carson River, just as Colton Lancaster was about to mount his horse, and something about the sound made every muscle in his body tense with alarm. He spun around, his eyes scanning the riverbank where the women from town often came to wash clothes in the late afternoon. The sun hung low over Nevada's dusty horizon, painting everything in shades of amber and gold, but Colton's attention fixed on the ripples spreading across the water's surface. Then he saw her, the dark fabric of a dress blooming like a strange flower beneath the surface, and a tangle of auburn hair fanning out in the current. Without thinking, Colton dropped the reins and ran. His boots kicked up dust as he sprinted the 30 yards to the water's edge, already unbuckling his gun belt. He threw it aside and plunged into the river, the shocking cold stealing his breath for just a moment before training and instinct took over. The Carson wasn't deep here, maybe 8 feet in the center, but the current could be tricky this time of year in the spring of 1883, fed by snowmelt from the Sierra Nevada. He reached her in 4 powerful strokes, his arms cutting through the water. She wasn't struggling, which terrified him more than if she had been fighting to surface. His arm hooked around her waist and he pulled her against his chest, kicking hard toward the bank. She was slight in his arms, but waterlogged clothing added weight. Colton's boots finally found purchase on the muddy bottom, and he hauled them both onto the grass, laying her down gently. Miss, can you hear me?" He turned her onto her side, and water spilled from her mouth. She coughed, her whole body convulsing with the effort, and Colton felt relief flood through him. She was breathing. Her eyes fluttered open, the most striking green he'd ever seen, and for a moment they just stared at each other, both breathing hard. "You're safe now," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Just breathe easy." She nodded, coughing again, and he helped her sit up. Water streamed from her hair and dress, creating dark patches on the pale grass. Other people were running toward them now. He could hear excited voices and the rustle of skirts as the women who'd been washing clothes upstream came to see what had happened. "Eleanor! Oh my Lord, Eleanor!" An older woman dropped to her knees beside them, her face pale with shock. "What happened? Did you slip?" The young woman, Eleanor, didn't answer right away. She was still looking at Colton with those incredible green eyes, something in her expression he couldn't quite read. Shame, maybe, or something else. "I'll fetch the doctor," someone said, and footsteps hurried away. "No need," Eleanor finally spoke, her voice hoarse. "I'm fine, just shaken." "You could have drowned," the older woman said, wringing her hands, "if Mr. Lancaster hadn't been here." "But he was here," Eleanor said softly, her eyes still on Colton's face. Colton stood up, suddenly aware of how his wet clothes clung to him. "Can you stand, miss?" She nodded, and he offered his hand. Her fingers were cold and trembling when they clasped his, but she pulled herself to her feet with more strength than he'd expected. She swayed slightly, and his other hand came up to steady her elbow. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saving me." Anyone would have done the same, he said, though he wasn't sure that was true. He'd been the only man nearby, and he'd reacted faster than he'd thought possible. The older woman, who Eleanor called Aunt Martha, wrapped a shawl around Eleanor's shoulders and began fussing over her, asking questions, trying to understand how this had happened. Eleanor gave vague answers about losing her footing on the slippery rocks, about the current being stronger than she'd thought. But Colton noticed she kept glancing at him, and each time their eyes met, that strange, unreadable expression returned. "I should get you home," Martha said firmly. "Come along, dear. You need dry clothes and hot tea." Eleanor allowed herself to be led away, but she looked back over her shoulder at Colton one more time. He raised his hand in a small wave, and something flickered across her face. Gratitude, certainly, but underneath it, something that looked almost like determination. Colton retrieved his gun belt and walked back to his horse, his mind replaying those few minutes. Something nagged at him about the whole incident. The way she'd fallen, or rather, the way she hadn't seemed to fight the water. The look in her eyes when she'd surfaced. He shook his head, water droplets flying from his dark hair. He was being foolish. Near drowning did strange things to people. She'd probably been in shock. He rode back into Goldfield as the sun touched the horizon, his clothes mostly dried by the warm Nevada wind. Goldfield was a decent-sized mining town, swollen with people seeking their fortunes in silver and gold. The main street bustled with activity even as evening approached. Miners heading to the saloons, families finishing their shopping, a piano already jangling from the Silver Star. Colton stabled his horse at the livery and headed to the boarding house where he'd been staying for the past 3 months. He'd come to Goldfield looking for work, and he'd found it at the Double R Ranch just outside town, managing cattle and breaking horses. It was honest work, and it suited him fine after years of drifting from town to town, job to job, trying to outrun a past that felt like it belonged to someone else. That night, lying in his narrow bed, he couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor. He realized he didn't even know her last name. Those green eyes haunted him, along with that strange expression. In the morning, he told himself, he'd think more clearly about it. In the morning, everything would make sense. But morning brought a surprise. He was drinking coffee at the boarding house dining table when Mrs. Chen, the proprietor, set down a plate of eggs and bacon in front of him and said, "Heard you're quite the hero, Mr. Lancaster. Saving Eleanor Reeves from drowning like that." "News travels fast," Colton said, picking up his fork. "In a town this size. Always does, Mrs. Chen refilled his coffee cup. "She's a sweet girl, that Eleanor. Been in Goldfield about 6 months now, living with her aunt since her parents passed. Tragedy, that. Fever took them both last winter." Colton's chest tightened with sympathy. "That's rough." "She's been having a hard time of it," Mrs. Chen continued, settling into the chair across from him with her own cup of coffee. She liked to talk, and Colton had learned it was easier to just let her. "Quiet girl, keeps to herself mostly. Works at the general store 3 days a week. Her aunt worries about her." "I can imagine yesterday didn't help with that worry," Colton said. Mrs. Chen gave him a knowing look. "You planning to check on her, see how she's doing?" The thought hadn't occurred to him, but now that she'd mentioned it, it seemed like the polite thing to do. "Maybe I'll stop by the general store if I'm in town." "She'll be there today," Mrs. Chen said with a satisfied nod. "Works Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays." It was Thursday. Colton finished his breakfast and tried to tell himself that he needed to buy supplies anyway, that it had nothing to do with wanting to see those green eyes again and figure out what had been bothering him about the whole incident. The general store was at the center of Goldfield's Main Street, a large building that smelled of leather, coffee, and sawdust. Bells chimed when Colton pushed open the door, and his eyes immediately found Eleanor behind the counter, measuring out flour for an older gentleman. She looked up at the sound, and when she saw Colton, her face flushed pink. "Mr. Lancaster," she said, her voice steadier than it had been yesterday. "Good morning." "Morning, Miss Reeves." He nodded to her and browsed the shelves while she finished with her customer, picking up items he actually did need. Tobacco for rolling cigarettes, a new leather strap for his saddlebag, a bar of soap. When the older man left, Colton approached the counter. Eleanor's hands were folded in front of her, and she watched him with those remarkable eyes. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "After yesterday?" "I'm well, thank you. A bit embarrassed, truth be told." She began tallying his items. That'll be $2.15. He counted out the money, and when he placed it in her palm, their fingers brushed. She pulled back quickly, but not before he saw the color deepen in her cheeks. "You don't need to be embarrassed," he said gently. "Accidents happen." She looked up at him sharply, and for a moment he saw something flash in her eyes. Fear? No, not quite. Something closer to guilt. "Yes," she said quietly. "Accidents." The bell chimed again as another customer entered, and Eleanor's attention shifted away from him. Colton gathered his purchases, but as he turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. At the door, he glanced back and found her watching him, and this time the longing in her expression was unmistakable. Over the next week, Colton found himself thinking about Eleanor Reeves more than he cared to admit. He threw himself into work at the Double R, spending long days in the saddle, working with the cattle, fixing fences, doing everything he could to exhaust himself. But at night, lying in his bed, those green eyes would appear in his mind. He saw her again on Sunday at church. He wasn't much of a church-going man, but in a town like Goldfield it was expected, and he'd learned that fitting in made life easier. Eleanor sat 3 rows ahead with her aunt, wearing a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. He tried to focus on Reverend Thompson's sermon about forgiveness and redemption, but his gaze kept drifting to the curve of Eleanor's neck, the way auburn curls escaped from beneath her bonnet. After the service, people gathered outside in the sunshine, talking and making plans. Colton was discussing cattle prices with John Rafferty, the owner of the Double R, when he noticed Eleanor standing alone near the church steps. Her aunt was deep in conversation with a group of other older women, and Eleanor seemed to be waiting, her hands clasped in front of her. "Excuse me a moment," Colton said to John and walked over to her. Eleanor looked up as he approached, and something like relief crossed her face. "Miss Reeves," he said, removing his hat. "Nice day, isn't it?" "It is," she agreed. "Mr. Lancaster, I wanted to thank you properly for what you did. I don't think I did that very well at the store. You thanked me just fine." "I was flustered," she said, looking down at her hands. "I'm not usually good with words when I'm nervous. I make you nervous." She met his eyes then, and the honesty in her gaze took his breath away. "Yes," she said simply. "You do." Before Colton could respond, her aunt called to her, and Eleanor excused herself with an apologetic smile. But as she walked away, Colton felt something shift in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Interest, certainly. Attraction, absolutely. But also curiosity and a strange sense that Eleanor Reeves was going to change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. 3 days later, he was in town again, and this time he didn't pretend he needed supplies. He went straight to the general store, and when Eleanor saw him, her face lit up in a way that made his heart skip. "Mr. Lancaster," she said, and there was warmth in her voice. "Back so soon?" "Call me Colton," he said. "And I was wondering if you might like to take a walk sometime. When you're not working, I mean, if that would be proper." She smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed her whole face. "I'd like that very much. I finish work in an hour." "I'll wait," he said, and meant it. They walked along the edge of town that afternoon, staying in sight of other people as was proper, talking about simple things at first. The weather, the town, how Nevada was different from where each of them had come from. Colton learned that Eleanor had grown up in Sacramento, that her father had been a clerk, and her mother had taken in sewing. They died within days of each other during a terrible winter fever, leaving Eleanor alone at 19. "My Aunt Martha is my mother's sister," Eleanor explained as they walked past a cluster of cottonwood trees. "She insisted I come live with her. I didn't want to be a burden, but she wouldn't hear otherwise." "Doesn't sound like a burden to me," Colton said. Sounds like family taking care of each other, I suppose. Eleanor paused to look out at the mountains in the distance, purple shadows against the bright sky. What about you? Do you have family? Not anymore, Colton said, the old familiar ache settling in his chest. My mother died when I was 12. Never knew my father. I was raised by my uncle on his ranch in Texas, but he passed 5 years ago. Been on my own since then. I'm sorry, Eleanor said softly, and when she touched his arm gently, he felt the warmth of her hand through his shirt sleeve. It's all right. You learn to make your own way. They walked in companionable silence for a while, and Colton found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did around people. There was something easy about being with Eleanor, something that felt natural and right. Can I ask you something? He said finally, the question that had been nagging at him since that day at the river pushing its way to the surface. Of course. That day at the river. What really happened? Eleanor stopped walking. Her face went pale, then flushed, and she looked away from him toward the mountains again. I told you, I slipped on the rocks, Eleanor. He kept his voice gentle but firm. I've been around water my whole life. I've seen people who fell in by accident, and I've seen people who jumped. You didn't struggle. You didn't fight to get back to the surface. She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't jump to hurt myself. I need you to know that. I wasn't trying to die. Colton's blood ran cold. Then why? She turned to face him, and tears were streaming down her cheeks. Because I'd been watching you for weeks. Every time you came to town, I'd see you and I couldn't look away. You were so kind to everyone, so strong and sure of yourself, and I thought you were the most handsome man I'd ever seen. She laughed, a broken sound. But you never looked at me, not once. I was invisible to you. He stared at her, his mind struggling to process what she was saying. That day, I saw you getting ready to leave, and I couldn't bear it. The thought of you leaving without ever really seeing me. So I did something stupid and desperate and foolish. I jumped in, hoping you'd save me, hoping you'd notice me. And you did. More tears spilled down her face. I'm so sorry. I'm so ashamed. It was such a terrible thing to do, to manipulate you like that. Colton stood there, feeling like he'd been punched in the gut. Part of him was angry at the deception, at the risk she'd taken with her own life. But a larger part of him was overwhelmed by the desperate loneliness that must have driven her to such an act. He knew that kind of loneliness. He'd felt it himself, in the long years of drifting from place to place with no one to call home. Eleanor, he said, stepping closer to her. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks. That was a dangerous thing to do. You could have died. I know, she sobbed. I know, and I've been sick about it ever since. But I couldn't tell you the truth. How could I? You saved my life, and it was all a lie. Not all of it, he said quietly. He tilted her chin up so she had to look at him. The part about you watching me, about wanting me to notice you, that was true, wasn't it? She nodded, unable to speak. And the part about me saving you, that was real. I did save you, Eleanor. Maybe not from the river, but from being invisible. Because I see you now. I've been seeing you every day since then, even when you're not in front of me. You have. Hope flickered in her eyes, fragile as candlelight. I have. I came to the store 3 times this week just to see you. I sat in church and couldn't hear a word of the sermon because I was too busy looking at the back of your neck. I've been thinking about you constantly, wondering what it was about you that got under my skin. He smiled slightly. Now I know. You're the bravest, most reckless, most honest woman I've ever met. I'm not brave, she protested. I'm a coward. I couldn't even talk to you like a normal person. You're talking to me now, and you just told me the truth even though it might make me walk away. That takes courage. Are you? She asked, her voice small. Going to walk away, Colton thought about it, really thought about it. What she'd done was reckless and dangerous. But he couldn't find it in himself to be angry, not when he understood the desperation behind it, not when her honesty now was so complete and raw. "No," he said. "I'm not walking away, but I need you to promise me something, anything. Promise me you'll never do anything like that again. Promise me that if you want my attention, you'll just ask for it. Because, Eleanor, you already have it. You don't need to risk your life to be seen by me." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but these seemed different, lighter somehow. "I promise," she whispered. "I promise, Colton." He pulled her into his arms then, and she came willingly, pressing her face against his chest. He could feel her trembling, could feel the relief and emotion pouring out of her. He held her carefully, aware of how fragile this moment was, how precious. "We're going to take this slow," he said into her hair. "We're going to get to know each other properly. And Eleanor, I'm going to court you the right way, with your aunt's permission and everything proper. Can you be patient with that?" She pulled back to look up at him, and she was smiling through her tears. "Yes, I can be patient, as long as I know you're not going anywhere." "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. The next few weeks were the happiest of Colton's life. He courted Eleanor properly, calling on her at her aunt's house, taking her for supervised walks, sitting in the parlor making conversation while Aunt Martha watched them like a hawk from her chair by the fireplace. It was all very proper and very correct, and Colton found he didn't mind at all because it meant spending time with Eleanor. He learned that she loved to read, that she'd gone through every book in the Goldfield Lending Library twice. He learned that she could play the piano, though she rarely did in public, because it made her nervous. He learned that she had a wicked sense of humor that came out when she felt comfortable, making observations about the people in town that were so accurate they made him laugh out loud. Eleanor learned things about him too, that he'd wanted to be a rancher since he was a boy, that he dreamed of having his own spread someday, that he loved horses more than almost anything, that he could spend hours just watching them move across a pasture, that he'd read only 3 books in his whole life, but could recite large passages from all of them, because once something was in his head, it stayed there. They were different in many ways, but they fit together like pieces of a puzzle. Where Eleanor was quiet and reserved, Colton drew her out with patient questions. Where Colton was practical and straightforward, Eleanor showed him beauty in things he'd never noticed before, pointing out the way light hit the mountains at sunset, or how the wind through the cottonwoods sounded like whispered conversations. Aunt Martha approved of the courtship, though she kept a close eye on them. "That's a good man," she told Eleanor one evening after Colton had left. "He's steady and kind, but Eleanor, you need to be sure. Marriage is forever and you've known each other such a short time." "I'm sure," Eleanor said, and she was. The guilt over how they'd met still gnawed at her sometimes, but Colton had forgiven her completely, and she was learning to forgive herself. Summer came to Nevada in full force, bringing heat that shimmered off the dusty streets and turned the mountains hazy in the distance. Colton took Eleanor on a picnic by the Carson River, carefully avoiding the spot where everything had started. They spread a blanket under a cottonwood tree and ate the lunch Aunt Martha had packed: fried chicken, fresh bread, apple pie. "I've been thinking," Colton said, lying back on the blanket and looking up through the leaves at the blue sky beyond, "about the future." Eleanor's heart skipped. They'd been courting for 2 months now, and she'd been hoping, dreaming, but afraid to push. "What about it? John Rafferty, my boss at the Double R, he's getting old. Wants to retire in a few years. He's been talking about maybe selling me part of the ranch, letting me buy in as a partner." Colton sat up and turned to look at her. "It would mean I'd be staying in Goldfield permanent, like, putting down roots." "That sounds wonderful," Eleanor said, trying to keep the hope out of her voice. Thing is, it's not the kind of life a man should live alone. A ranch needs a family. Needs someone to build it for. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle around hers. Eleanor, I know it's soon. I know we haven't known each other long, but I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I love you. Eleanor felt her eyes fill with tears, but these were tears of pure joy. I love you too. I have since the first time I saw you, even if that makes me sound foolish. It doesn't make you sound foolish. It makes you sound honest, which is one of the things I love most about you. He squeezed her hand. So I'm asking, Eleanor Reeves, will you marry me? Yes, she said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, of course, yes. Colton pulled her into his arms and kissed her for the first time, a gentle, sweet kiss that tasted like promises and new beginnings. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling so wide it hurt. They were married on a crisp September morning in 1883, with the whole town of Goldfield turning out to see the wedding at the little white church. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried wildflowers that Colton had picked himself that morning. Colton wore his best suit, his dark hair slicked back, looking more handsome than Eleanor had ever seen him. Aunt Martha cried through the whole ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. They're happy tears, she assured anyone who asked. The reception was held at the town hall, with music and dancing and more food than anyone could possibly eat. Colton danced with Eleanor until her feet ached, holding her close and whispering in her ear how beautiful she looked, how lucky he was, how much he loved her. I still can't believe you said yes, he murmured as they swayed to a slow waltz. I still can't believe you asked, she replied, smiling up at him. Sometimes I think about that day at the river, and I can't believe how differently things might have turned out. Don't think about that, Colton said firmly. What matters is we found each other. However it happened, we found each other, and now we get to spend the rest of our lives together. They moved into a small house on the Double R Ranch, a 3-room cabin that needed work but had good bones and a beautiful view of the mountains. Eleanor threw herself into making it a home, sewing curtains, planting a garden, learning to cook on the temperamental wood stove. Colton worked long hours with the cattle and horses, but he always came home to Eleanor, always made time to sit with her in the evenings and talk about their days. Their first winter together was hard but wonderful. Snow fell heavy in the mountains and dusted the valley floor. Colton taught Eleanor to ride, and they'd go out together on the clear days, racing across the open land with the cold wind in their faces. At night, they'd curl up together by the fire, reading aloud from books Eleanor borrowed from the library or just talking about their dreams for the future. I want children, Eleanor said one night, her head on Colton's shoulder. At least 3, maybe 4. I want that too, Colton agreed. Want to fill this house with noise and laughter. Want to teach them to ride and rope and raid. Want to love them the way we love each other, Eleanor added softly. Exactly that. Spring came again, bringing new life to the ranch. The cattle had calved successfully, and John Rafferty was so pleased with Colton's work that he formalized the partnership offer. Colton would buy into the ranch gradually, with a portion of his wages going toward ownership. In 10 years, he'd own half of the Double R outright. Eleanor celebrated with him that night, cooking a special dinner and wearing her best dress. I'm so proud of you, she said, raising her glass of cider in a toast. You've worked so hard for this. We've worked hard, Colton corrected. None of this would mean anything without you. That summer, Eleanor discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Colton one evening when he came in from working with the horses, his shirt dusty and his face tanned from the sun. Sit down, she said, smiling mysteriously. I have news. Colton sat, his expression curious. Good news, I hope, the best news. We're going to have a baby. For a moment, Colton just stared at her, his expression frozen. Then he whooped with joy, jumping up and sweeping her into his arms, spinning her around carefully before setting her down and dropping to his knees, pressing his ear against her still flat stomach. Really? We're really having a baby. Really, Eleanor confirmed, running her fingers through his hair. The doctor confirmed it yesterday. The baby should come in January. Colton looked up at her with tears in his eyes. I'm going to be a father. Eleanor, I'm going to be a father. You're going to be a wonderful father, she said, and she believed it with her whole heart. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Eleanor was often tired and sick in the early months. Colton fussed over her constantly, making sure she rested, bringing her ginger tea for the nausea, rubbing her feet when they ached. Aunt Martha visited regularly, bringing baby clothes she'd been sewing and advice Eleanor didn't always want but appreciated anyway. As winter approached and Eleanor's belly grew round, Colton became increasingly nervous about the birth. What if something goes wrong? He'd ask Eleanor late at night. What if I lose you? You won't lose me, Eleanor would assure him, taking his hand and placing it on her stomach so he could feel the baby kick. I'm strong and the doctor says everything looks perfect. In a few months, we'll be holding our baby. Their son was born on a cold January night in 1885, during a snowstorm that blanketed the valley in white. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Colton, pacing outside the bedroom door, thought he might lose his mind with worry. But when he finally heard the baby's first cry, strong and healthy, he nearly collapsed with relief. The midwife emerged from the bedroom with a smile. You have a son, Mr. Lancaster. A big, healthy boy. Your wife is tired but doing well. You can come in now. Colton entered the bedroom on shaking legs. Eleanor lay propped against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blue blanket. Come meet your son, she said softly. Colton approached carefully, as if afraid he might break something just by existing. He looked down at the baby and felt his heart expand in his chest. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was making little mewing sounds, his tiny fists waving. He's perfect, Colton whispered. Eleanor, he's absolutely perfect. You want to hold him, Colton nodded, and Eleanor carefully transferred the baby into his arms. Colton had held foals and calves, had worked with his hands his whole life, but nothing had prepared him for the terror and wonder of holding his own child. The baby was so small, so fragile, yet when those tiny eyes opened and seemed to look right at him, Colton felt something fundamental shift in his soul. Hello, son, he said quietly. I'm your father. And I promise you right now, I'm going to do everything I can to be the best father you could ever want. I'm going to keep you safe and teach you everything I know and love you more than you can imagine. We should name him, Eleanor said, smiling at the picture they made together. They'd discussed names for months but hadn't been able to decide. Now, looking at his son, Colton knew exactly what the name should be. How about Carson, after the river where your mother and I met? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Carson Lancaster, it's perfect. Baby Carson was a good baby, sleeping in stretches and eating well. Colton was besotted with him, spending every free minute watching him sleep or making faces to earn those first gummy smiles. Eleanor recovered well from the birth, and soon their little house was filled with the sounds of a baby. Crying, cooing, the creak of the rocking chair as Eleanor nursed him or sang him lullabies. Aunt Martha visited often, spoiling her great-nephew shamelessly. He looks just like his father, she'd say, bouncing Carson on her knee. Same dark hair and serious expression. He has Eleanor's eyes, though, Colton would point out proudly. That beautiful green. Life settled into a rhythm. Colton worked the ranch, slowly buying more ownership from John Rafferty. Eleanor cared for Carson in their home and somehow found time to still read and play piano when the baby napped. They were happy in a deep, contented way that neither of them had known was possible. When Carson was a year old, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news felt different, more familiar but no less joyful. Colton still worried, but he'd gained confidence from seeing Eleanor come through the first birth successfully. Their daughter was born in the autumn of 1886, an easier birth than Carson's had been. She came into the world screaming with indignation, her face red and furious, her tiny fists pumping. "She's got spirit," the midwife said with a laugh. "This one's going to keep you on your toes." They named her Rose after Eleanor's mother, and she was indeed a spirited child. Where Carson had been calm and observant, Rose was active and demanding. She wanted to be held constantly, wanted to see everything, touch everything, be part of everything. "I think she's going to be trouble," Colton said one evening, watching as 7-month-old Rose pulled herself up on the furniture, determined to walk even though she was far too young. "She's going to be extraordinary," Eleanor corrected, swooping in to catch Rose before she fell. "Just like her father." "Her father is extraordinarily tired," Colton teased, but he was smiling. He loved the chaos of their growing family, loved coming home to children's laughter and Eleanor's smile. The years passed quickly, marked by the milestones of growing children. Carson took his first steps, then Rose followed quickly behind, refusing to be left out of anything her older brother did. Carson spoke in full sentences at 2, asking endless questions about everything he saw. Rose was slower to talk, but made up for it with determination, finding ways to communicate exactly what she wanted. John Rafferty retired when Colton was 27, selling Colton the other half of the ranch at a price far below market value. "You've earned it," the old man said, shaking Colton's hand. "You turned this place around, made it profitable again. It should be yours." The Double R was renamed the Lancaster Ranch, and Colton felt the weight of responsibility and pride settle on his shoulders. This was his now, his and Eleanor's and their children's. Legacy made real in land and cattle and sweat. Eleanor was pregnant again when Carson turned 5 and Rose 3. This pregnancy was harder than the other two. She was tired constantly, her back ached, and she couldn't seem to keep food down in the early months. Colton hired a girl from town to help with the housework and the children, insisting that Eleanor rest as much as possible. "I'm fine," Eleanor protested. "Women have babies all the time." "Not my wife," Colton said firmly. "My wife is going to take care of herself and this baby and let others handle the cooking and cleaning for once." Their third child, another boy they named Matthew, was born healthy but small in the spring of 1888. He was a quiet baby, content to watch the world with solemn dark eyes. Carson, now 5.5, was fascinated by his new brother, wanting to help with everything. Rose was less impressed, jealous of the attention the baby received. "I baby too," she'd insist, climbing into Eleanor's lap while she nursed Matthew. "You're my big girl," Eleanor would say, kissing Rose's curly head. "I need my big girl to help me with the baby." That seemed to satisfy Rose, who took her new role seriously, bringing diapers when asked and singing garbled lullabies to her baby brother. Colton stood in the doorway one evening, watching Eleanor in the rocking chair with Matthew in her arms, Carson at her feet with a book and Rose leaning against her side. His family. His whole world contained in one room. Eleanor looked up and caught his expression. "What are you thinking about?" "How lucky I am," he said honestly. "How different my life could have been." Eleanor understood what he meant. She sometimes thought about it too, about that desperate girl who jumped into a river just to be noticed. She was so far from that person now, so much stronger and surer of herself. Colton had given her that, had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. "We're both lucky," she said softly. "We found each other." "We found each other," he agreed, coming to sit beside her, adding himself to the family tableau. The children grew like weeds, as children do. Carson was serious and studious, always asking questions and wanting to understand how things worked. By 7, he could read better than most adults in town and was helping his father with the ranch accounts. Rose was wild and fearless, climbing trees and racing her pony across the pastures, giving her parents heart attacks on a regular basis. Matthew was quiet and artistic, happiest when he had paper and pencils, drawing everything he saw. Eleanor loved them all fiercely, differently, loved watching them become themselves. Colton was a wonderful father, patient and kind but firm when needed. He taught Carson to rope and ride, taught Rose to gentle a horse with soft words and softer hands, sat for hours with Matthew looking at his drawings and asking questions that made the boy light up with pride. In 1892, when Eleanor was 29 and Colton 31, they had their fourth and final child, a daughter they named Clara. She was a surprise baby, coming along when they'd thought their family was complete, but she was loved no less for being unexpected. Clara was a happy baby, smiling constantly, charming everyone who met her. "This is our last one," Eleanor said firmly after Clara's birth. 4 children were plenty, and her body was tired from years of pregnancy and nursing. "This is perfect," Colton agreed, looking at Clara's tiny face. "Our family is perfect just as it is." Life on the Lancaster ranch was busy but full of love. The children helped with chores as they grew older, learning the value of hard work. They went to the small schoolhouse in Goldfield, riding in together on the wagon. Carson excelled at his studies, talking about maybe going to university someday. Rose declared school boring but loved the social aspect, collecting friends like some people collected stamps. Matthew struggled with reading, but could draw anything he'd seen once, his talent growing more evident with each passing year. Aunt Martha remained a constant presence in their lives, growing older but no less sharp. She'd bounce Clara on her knee and tell stories about Eleanor as a girl, embarrassing Eleanor and delighting the children. "Your mother was always so serious," Martha would say. "Had her nose in a book constantly. I used to worry she'd never find a husband." "And then she found me," Colton would add, winking at Eleanor. "Well, technically I found you," Eleanor would correct, and they'd share a look full of private understanding and love. The incident at the river had become part of their family lore, though the children didn't know the whole truth. They knew their parents had met when their father saved their mother from drowning, knew it as a romantic story of rescue and love. Someday, when they were older, Eleanor thought she might tell them the real story, but not yet. Not while they still saw the world in such simple terms of right and wrong, hero and victim. The years flowed by like the Carson River, sometimes fast and exciting, sometimes slow and peaceful, but always moving forward. Carson grew tall and serious, deciding at 15 that he wanted to be a lawyer, wanting to use his mind to help people. Colton and Eleanor supported his dream, starting to save money for university. Rose at 13 was beautiful and wild, with more suitors than she knew what to do with. She made it clear she wasn't interested in any of them, declaring that she was going to travel the world before she even thought about marriage. Eleanor saw herself in Rose sometimes, that desperate need to be seen and understood, But Rose had confidence Eleanor had lacked at that age. She'd been raised knowing she was loved, knowing she was valued, and it showed in everything she did. Matthew at 11 was quiet and thoughtful, his drawings getting more sophisticated. A traveling art dealer came through Goldfield and saw some of Matthew's work, offering to sell it in San Francisco. Colton and Eleanor were bursting with pride. Clara at 5 was still their baby, sweet and affectionate, following her older siblings around and copying everything they did. In 1897, Aunt Martha passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 72. Eleanor grieved deeply for the woman who'd taken her in when she had nothing, who'd supported her and loved her, and given her blessing to marry Colton. They buried Martha in the Goldfield Cemetery on a hill overlooking the town, with a headstone that read "Beloved Sister and Aunt." She was happy at the end, Colton told Eleanor as they stood at the grave after the funeral. She got to see you happy, see our children growing up. That meant everything to her. I know, Eleanor said, wiping tears from her eyes. I just wish I could tell her one more time how grateful I am for everything she did for me. She knew, Colton assured her, pulling her close. She absolutely knew. Life continued on the ranch. The children grew older, pursuing their various dreams and interests. Carson went off to university in San Francisco in 1898, writing long letters home about his studies and the city. Eleanor saved every letter, proud beyond measure of her oldest son. Rose at 16 was training horses on the ranch, having a natural gift with them that even Colton marveled at. She's better than I ever was, he'd admit, watching Rose gentle a skittish mare with patience and skill. Matthew's artwork was selling well, and he was talking about maybe going to art school in a few years. Clara was growing up sweet and kind, the peacemaker among the siblings, always finding ways to smooth over disputes. Colton turned 40 in 1899, and Eleanor threw him a party with the whole town invited. The ranch house, which they'd expanded over the years, was filled with people and laughter and music. Colton stood on the porch at one point, looking out at the celebration, at his wife and children and friends, at the land that was his, and felt a contentment so deep it brought tears to his eyes. Eleanor found him there, sliding her hand into his. "Happy birthday," she said softly. "Best birthday I've ever had," he replied. "Best life I've ever had." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't jumped in that river?" Eleanor asked. It was something they rarely talked about anymore, but sometimes she still thought about it. "No," Colton said firmly. "Because it doesn't matter. We're here now. We found each other, we built this life, we raised these incredible children. However it happened, I'm grateful for every single second." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder, watching their children dance in the yard, Rose twirling Clara while Matthew clapped and Carson, home from university for the summer, laughed at something a friend had said. "Me too," she whispered. "I'm grateful too." As the new century dawned in 1900, the Lancaster family was thriving. Carson graduated from university and opened a law practice in Goldfield, serving the community and making his parents proud. He married a sweet girl named Sarah, a teacher, and they began building their own life together. Rose surprised everyone by falling in love with a rancher's son from the next county over. She'd always sworn she'd never marry, but then she met Daniel and something changed. "I didn't think I needed anyone," she told her mother, "but he makes me want to stay in one place. Makes me want to build something together." Eleanor understood completely. That was how she'd felt about Colton, like suddenly all her restless loneliness had found a home. Rose married at 19 in a beautiful ceremony at the ranch, and Colton cried while walking his daughter down the makeshift aisle in the yard. "My little girl," he kept saying, and Rose, usually so tough and independent, cried too. Matthew got accepted to an art school in San Francisco when he was 17, and he thrived there, his talent blooming in ways that amazed everyone. His paintings started appearing in galleries, and the family made trips to the city to see his work displayed. Clara grew into a beautiful young woman, kind and gentle, working as a teacher in Goldfield and loving it. She had suitors, but she was in no hurry to marry, content with her work and her family. Colton and Eleanor, now in their 40s, watched their children build their own lives with a mixture of pride and bittersweetness. The ranch house was quieter now, with only Clara still living at home, and sometimes Eleanor missed the chaos of when they were all young. "We did good," Colton would say on those quiet evenings when it was just the two of them on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. "We did," Eleanor would agree. "We really did." Carson and Sarah had their first child in 1902, a baby boy they named after Colton. Eleanor held her first grandchild and felt the circle of life completing itself. This tiny baby, this new Lancaster, would grow up on stories about the ranch and the family, about the cowboy and the woman he'd saved from drowning. Rose and Daniel had twins in 1903, a boy and a girl, and Rose brought them to visit the ranch often, letting them run wild the way she'd once run wild. Watching Rose with her children, Eleanor saw how much her daughter had matured, how motherhood had softened her wild edges without taming her spirit. Matthew married in 1904, a fellow artist named Julia, and they stayed in San Francisco but visited when they could. Their home was filled with paintings and sculptures and creative energy, and when they had a daughter in 1905, they named her Martha after Eleanor's aunt. Clara married in 1906, a doctor who'd moved to Goldfield to open a practice. They settled in town but visited the ranch every Sunday for dinner, a tradition that Eleanor treasured. The years kept passing, bringing changes and challenges. The ranch prospered under Colton's management, even as the world around them modernized and changed. Automobiles started appearing on the streets of Goldfield. Electricity came to town, though the ranch was too far out to connect to it for many years yet. Colton's hair turned silver at the temples, and Eleanor found her first gray hairs, though she claimed Colton had caused every one of them with his worrying. They were older now, their bodies not quite as strong as they'd once been, but they were together, and that was all that mattered. They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in 1908 with all their children and grandchildren around them. The ranch yard was full of people, 3 generations of Lancasters, and Colton stood up to make a speech. 25 years ago, I married the most extraordinary woman I'd ever met, he said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. I saved her from drowning, and she saved me from a life half-lived, from drifting without purpose or meaning. Eleanor gave me everything, a home, a family, a reason to wake up every morning grateful for another day. She made me the man I am, and I love her more today than I did on our wedding day, which I didn't think was possible. Eleanor was crying, and so were half the people there. Colton raised his glass. To Eleanor, my wife, my love, my everything, here's to 25 more years. To Eleanor and Colton, everyone chorused and they drank and cheered. Later, when the party was winding down and the grandchildren were asleep in various bedrooms and on sofas, Colton and Eleanor walked down to the Carson River. It was the same spot where they'd had their picnic all those years ago, where Colton had proposed. The moon was bright, reflecting off the water, and it was peaceful in a way that made Eleanor's heart ache with beauty. "Do you remember that desperate girl who jumped in this river?" Eleanor asked softly. "I remember a brave girl who knew what she wanted and went after it," Colton corrected. I remember a girl who became a woman who's stronger and more amazing than anyone I've ever known. I remember a cowboy who didn't hesitate, who just dove in and saved me without thinking," Eleanor said. "Who keeps saving me, every single day." They stood in silence for a moment, hands clasped, looking at the water that had brought them together. "No regrets?" Colton asked. "Not a single one," Eleanor replied. "You? Only that I didn't notice you sooner. Think of all the time we could have had together if I just looked up and seen you watching me." Eleanor laughed. "We've had plenty of time, and we have more still. Didn't you just toast to 25 more years? At least," Colton said, pulling her close. "At least 25 more." He kissed her then, the way he'd kissed her on their wedding day, full of promise and love and forever. The Carson River flowed by, indifferent to human stories, but Colton and Eleanor knew better. This river was part of their story, the beginning of everything that mattered. They walked back to the house hand in hand, ready for whatever years remained to them, secure in the love they'd built and the life they'd made together. The years continued their steady march. Colton and Eleanor grew older gracefully, their love deepening with time. They watched their grandchildren grow, attended school plays and birthday parties, offered wisdom when asked, and tried not to interfere when it wasn't. In 1915, when Eleanor was 52 and Colton 54, they became great-grandparents when Carson's oldest had a baby. Holding that tiny infant, Colton marveled at how far they'd come from that day at the river 32 years ago. "For generations," he said to Eleanor that night. "Can you believe it?" "I can believe anything when I'm with you," she replied, and she meant it. They were in their 60s when the Great War touched their family. Carson's son enlisted despite his father's protests, feeling it was his duty. The family prayed for his safe return, and Eleanor spent anxious months knitting socks and writing letters, trying to keep her great-nephew connected to home. He returned safely in 1918, changed but whole, and the family celebrated with tears of relief and gratitude. Life was precious. They all knew it, and they held each other a little tighter after that. The ranch continued to thrive, though Colton handed over more and more of the management to his children and grandchildren as he aged. He was happy to advise and consult, but the daily work was too much for his aging body now. He and Eleanor spent their days in quieter pursuits, reading together, taking slow walks, sitting on the porch and watching the world go by. In 1923, they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. Colton was 62 and Eleanor 60. The celebration was smaller this time, just immediate family, but no less meaningful. Their children stood and gave speeches about what their parents' love had taught them, about the example they'd set. "You showed us that love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice you make every day," Carson said. "A choice to be kind, to be patient, to forgive, to stay. You showed us that real love can start in the strangest ways but grow into something beautiful," Rose added, not knowing how prophetic her words were. "You showed us that love is worth fighting for, worth building a life around," Matthew said quietly. "You showed us that happily ever after is real, but it takes work and commitment and grace," Clara finished. Colton and Eleanor held hands through it all, their fingers intertwined as they'd been for 40 years. When everyone had said their piece, Eleanor stood to speak. "I want to tell you all a story," she said, her voice clear despite her age. "The true story of how your father and I met." The room went quiet. The children knew the basics, but Eleanor had never told the whole truth before. Now, with 4 decades of marriage behind them, with their family spread before them, living proof of the love they'd built, it felt like time. She told them everything. About being alone and lonely after her parents' death, about seeing Colton in town and feeling drawn to him, about the desperate act of jumping into the river to get his attention. The room was silent as she spoke, and when she finished, there were tears on every face. "I'm not proud of what I did," Eleanor said. "It was dangerous and manipulative, but I'm grateful for what came of it. Your father could have walked away when I told him the truth. Instead, he chose to love me anyway, to see past my desperate act to the lonely girl underneath. He saved my life in more ways than one, and I've spent 40 years trying to be worthy of that love." Colton stood then, his movements slower than they'd once been but still sure. "You've been worthy every single day," he said firmly. "Eleanor, you gave me everything worth having. You gave me purpose and meaning and a family. You made me a better man than I ever thought I could be. That river was the luckiest thing that ever happened to me." "To us," Eleanor corrected, smiling through her tears. "It happened to us." Their children and grandchildren swarmed them then, hugging and crying and laughing. The story didn't change how they felt about their parents and grandparents. If anything, it made the love story even more precious, knowing the unlikely beginning and seeing what it had become. As the years passed into the late 1920s, Colton and Eleanor slowed down even more. They spent their days mostly on the porch of the ranch house, watching their great-grandchildren play in the yard, reading to each other from well-worn books, talking about memories. "Do you remember the first time I held Carson?" Colton would ask. "You remember when Rose climbed to the top of that oak tree and we had to get the neighbors to help get her down?" Eleanor would counter. They remembered it all, every moment precious because they'd lived it together. In the spring of 1930, Colton got sick. It started as a cough that wouldn't go away, then progressed to a fever. The doctor, their son-in-law married to Clara, came and examined him gravely. "His lungs are weak," he told the family quietly. "At his age, with pneumonia, it's difficult." The family gathered at the ranch, keeping vigil. Colton drifted in and out of consciousness, but whenever he woke, he looked for Eleanor, and she was always there, holding his hand. "I'm here," she'd whisper. "I'm right here, my love." On a quiet morning in early April, with Eleanor beside him and his children and grandchildren filling the room, Colton opened his eyes one last time. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm here," she said again, leaning close. "The river," he said, and she knew what he meant. "That day, that moment, that beginning. Best thing that ever happened to us," she agreed, tears streaming down her face. "Love you," he breathed. "Always loved you." "Always loved you too," she replied. "Always will." He smiled then, squeezed her hand with what little strength he had left, and closed his eyes. His breathing slowed, then stopped, and Colton Lancaster was gone. The grief was overwhelming. Eleanor felt like part of her soul had been ripped away. They'd been together for 47 years, and she didn't know how to exist without him. The family worried about her, but Eleanor was stronger than they knew. "He gave me a beautiful life," she told her children. "I'm not going to dishonor that by giving up now. He'd want me to keep going, to be here for all of you." So she kept going. She stayed at the ranch, surrounded by family, watching her great-great-grandchildren be born, telling stories about Colton, keeping his memory alive. She lived for another 5 years, and in that time, she wrote everything down. Their story, from that day at the river to his last breath, so that future generations would know the kind of love that was possible. On a warm September morning in 1935, Eleanor passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 72. Her family found her with a smile on her face and a letter clutched in her hand. It was addressed to Colton, written the night before, and her children wept as they read it. "My dearest love," it began. "I'll see you soon. Wait for me by the river." They buried Eleanor next to Colton in the Goldfield Cemetery, their headstones side by side. The epitaph on Eleanor's stone read, She jumped, and he saved her, and together they built a love that lasted forever. The ranch stayed in the Lancaster family, passed down through generations, each one hearing the story of Colton and Eleanor, the cowboy and the woman he saved from drowning. The story became legend, told and retold, a testament to the fact that love can begin in the strangest ways but grow into something extraordinary with time and care and commitment. The Carson River kept flowing, indifferent as always, but the Lancaster family knew better. That river was sacred ground, the birthplace of a love story that had created all of them. Every generation made pilgrimages to that spot, standing on the banks and imagining that day in 1883 when everything changed. Carson and Sarah's children, Rose and Daniel's twins, Matthew and Julia's daughter, Clara and her husband's sons, they all grew up hearing about how their grandparents met. They told their children, who told their children, who told theirs. The story lived on, proof that real love exists, that it can overcome anything, that it's worth every risk and every leap of faith. And somewhere in whatever comes after, Colton and Eleanor were together again, walking hand in hand beside a river that flowed with memories and love, their story complete, their forever finally truly forever. The Lancaster Ranch prospered through the decades, weathering the Great Depression and 2 world wars, always staying in the family, always connected to that original love story. In the main house, which had been expanded and modernized over the years, there hung a painting that Matthew had done before he died. Colton pulling Eleanor from the Carson River, the water droplets caught mid-air, the expression on both their faces one of surprise and destiny meeting. Beneath the painting, in a frame, was Eleanor's written account of their story, the one she'd penned in those last 5 years. Every Lancaster child was required to read it when they turned 18, to understand where they came from, to know the power of love and honesty and second chances. The tradition of Sunday dinners at the ranch continued for generations, with dozens of Lancasters gathering to share food and stories. They'd raise their glasses and toast to Colton and Eleanor, to the love that started it all, to the family that grew from a single desperate act and one cowboy's kind heart. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the Lancaster family remained strong, connected by blood and story and love. They spread across the country, pursuing various dreams, but they always came back to Goldfield, to the ranch, to the river. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the mountains and painted the world in shades of gold and amber, you could almost see them there. A cowboy and a woman, young again, walking hand in hand beside the Carson River, their love eternal, their story never ending, their legacy written in the hearts of every person who heard their tale and believed in the possibility of true, lasting, world-changing love.